So the Dean,
Suleiman.
how was your week, bro? How you feeling? How you doing?
I'm good. I've been doing BJJ for maybe 8 months now. I feel like I'm just plateauing. So I feel like now is like a point in my training, yeah, where I have to actually like do research and not just kind of like turn up on a day and kind of take more ownership over my development. I'm supposed to be competing in a tournament, a judo tournament in June. So I'm gonna have to really knuckle down in that sense. What about yourself?
That's sick, bro. That's really sick. It reminds me of when I used to study maths at school. And for the longest time I thought I could get away with just being good at times tables. But then eventually you
Mm.
realize there's more than just times tables. Um so yeah, man. God willing, it's a sign that you're gonna take it to the next level. To the next level.
Yeah,
Um
man.
my week's been good. Um Nothing, no crazy highlights to share. Just one reflection based on like a video I watched this week, which essentially talked about kind of what makes something funny. And the commentator basically said something is funny when it is kind of on the boundary between being benign and being violating. So it's like you kind of just need to strike the right balance. And obviously it depends on the person you're speaking to, but the most funny comments or jokes are probably right at the edge of kind of what is harmless and what is potentially violating. So that's something that I found quite interesting to hear. Um, but yeah, man, today we're
Um,
very lucky to have a guest. Brother Sean, how are you? How's your week been?
My week, yeah, interesting one. First of all, thank you for allowing me to come and yap in a sort of unlimited, unconstrained way for a whole hour with you guys. Um, my week, I've done a lot of running. So if we're keeping on the sort of topic of sports, first of all, I can't even fight. So let me put that out there. Like as a man, if someone's coming to scrap me, the only sort of tool I have is my physicality to run away, but also my voice to kind of just maybe talk them out of it. But no, I went on a run with one of my boys from Kent. So if you know anything about Kent English white boys, it's that they came out the womb doing like long distance cross country and all these sorts of things. So he just ran the marathon, the London Marathon in 2 hours 43, which is
wow.
like an insane time. So then I wanted to go on a 10K with him just to see how I can sort of keep up. And I was doing all right, to be fair. I think I want to lean into running a bit more. And I did like some interval training for the first time, and that was pretty intense. But other than that, yeah, alhamdulillah, the week's good. I mean, the sun's out in London, so then London becomes like an entirely new universe. Um, but yeah, I think I'm about to go to Turkey end of the month, which is pretty cool. So like prepping for that and these sorts of things. But yeah, everything's good. Things feel fairly balanced.
There's something so cool about being not very good at something and doing it with someone that's really good at it. How did that feel?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's not that I'm not very good. I'm okay in it. So don't don't come from that ego in that way. But second of all, no, it is quite mental. So like a lot of my close friends are like elite athletes, and that's not even an exaggeration. So Jamie, who the boy I met, he's like obviously in an elite level. My best friend I grew up with, a guy called Callum, he's upcoming Team GB for 800 meters. So even running with him is like just a humbling experience. Um, no, it really does push you because I don't think I would be sort of it's like healthy competition because I like to keep people close around me who make me want to be better in some sort of way. And they definitely do that. So I think yeah, it's good to just to be in a space where like because it's like give and take. So like in the sports realm, I can learn a lot from them. But then if something comes up in the news or politics, they'll just message me first and be like, "So what's going on here?" So it's good to see that like yeah, we provide a lot of value to each other in that way.
So the question that we like to kick off with is about kind of your early life. And the way that we typically phrase it is what what are some of your earliest memories from childhood? What stands out?
That's crazy. See, the thing about me, I got a bad memory. I like misplace things all the time and things like that. So you're making me think rather introspectively. Um, I think well, a big sort of marker of growing up was spending a lot of time with my grandma. So I was raised by my mum and my grandma, uh, which was obviously like a very interesting experience because they came from Trinidad. So it's like in this kind of like four walls of my house, it's like I'm in the Caribbean pretty much. But then you kind of step out and then you're in London and then well, that kind of like those subtle differences were quite interesting. For example, they were quite strict but also quite loving. So um I never used to get in trouble at school. I used to be so scared to get in trouble at school, but not because of the teachers, but because of like my grandma. Because I knew if I'd come home and she'd find out, she'd absolutely tear me apart. So that was that. Um, I think, yeah, I guess, yeah, people don't really like to open up about things like this, but my dad wasn't really around growing up. And again, coming back to like the typical Caribbean stereotype of not having a dad, I definitely fulfilled that one. So he was in and out, but that didn't really affect me because all I ever knew was my mum and my grandma. So it's really weird. Actually, conceiving of my mum loving like a man is insane to me. I think that's strange. That can't happen. Um, so that was the kind of like I suppose earliest experience of like being quite attached to my grandma, asking her to take me to the park and these sorts of things, her cooking for me and things like that. And my mum was around. It's just that she had to work quite a lot. Um, so I think that was probably the most kind of foundational aspect and I'm sure we'll get into it, but it kind of like helped me understand like the world in like a lot of different ways because of like the kind of traditional upbringing as well. So like a Caribbean sort of Muslim upbringing, but not really, which I'm sure we'll unpack. But I think yeah, those are kind of my. It's not an experience that I remember, but that's probably what I think about most when I think back to my childhood. Just my grandma.
In terms of your mum and grandma raising you, are there any ways that, looking back now, you see parts of yourself in them?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I think recently, um, so one thing about Caribbean women is that they're quite fierce and quite stern. So the way I'm actually very different to them is so that's the thing I've been looking at how I'm very different to them is that I don't have like an aggressive bone in my body. Like I'm not an aggressive person. So even when I'm playing football and then man are coming with egos or whatever, I'm there for a workout. I don't even care if I win or lose. Yeah, but then like I can just imagine like, okay, cool, if my grandma's playing football, my mom's playing football, they'll be the ones like having the competitive edge. So that's been quite interesting to me that I think I kind of want to build out the confrontation muscle a bit more because I don't know if it's British sensibilities or something like that, which makes me think that, oh, it's a bit awkward to kind of like speak out if something's a bit wrong or, kind of like just brush things. I think I quite admire their ability to make things awkward and like kind of stand up for like what's right and what's wrong or against what's wrong. So there's that. I think my grandma was a very generous person. So every time I go to the school, so one of the experiences I remember is getting quite jealous that all the kids used to run to her purse to get sweets. And I used to be thinking, you should be saving the sweets for me. Like you shouldn't be giving these sweets to all these other kids. And also yeah, so I think there's that sort of generosity which I try to sort of imbue. So like, I don't know, like simple things like you're going out with your friends and stuff, just cover the bill. Like, who cares? Like, don't pay me back. That's another thing. I hate the concept of paying back. I think they taught me that as well. Is in this house, no one ever owed anything to anyone. You kind of just did it. Um, I think my mum, though, she's very charismatic, and in a sort of non-self-centered way, people have told me I'm quite charismatic all my life, and I do think that's a reflection of her. It's so she works in a law firm, like a very kind of big top corporate law firm, but she's sort of quote unquote just a personal assistant, and even though her role isn't senior, all the big lawyers like say she runs the place. So kind of like a Donna from Suits type figure. Um, so I'm quite grateful to have that sort of, I guess, similarity with my mum. And she never lets me forget it, to be honest. She always tells me the reason you are the way you are is because of me. And I was like, okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
So interesting. Um, Sean, one question that comes to mind is around this idea of tradition, right? And
Mhm.
how has your relationship with tradition evolved over time? And kind of because you mentioned that in your home growing up, there was a there was a distinct culture, and I'm sure that culture came with rituals and habits and routines that kind of shaped your experience. So, I mean, what is your relationship with tradition, and what is the value of tradition to you?
Yeah, I think I've had a sort of journey on my own relationship to this concept of tradition. I think in like modernity and being a young person growing up in a very kind of cosmopolitan like London sphere, tradition has very bad connotations because obviously you think of like perhaps the Conservative Party, or you think of like backwardsness of like, I don't know, like gender roles being like an inherently bad thing or something along those lines. So I think growing up as a very kind of liberal individual, I used to think of it as like basically not good. Like actually we need to be forward thinking. These kind of backwards traditions hold no value. Progress is quite linear, right? Like you're kind of moving forward and moving past outdated practices and basically ways of the past. But I think like so I kind of mentioned growing up in a sort of Muslim environment because I think Trinidadian culture, even though it has a lot of traditional elements, and my upbringing had a lot of tradition, is quite nuanced because I think the reason I personally wasn't raised Muslim is because of the fact that religion itself started getting watered down over generations. Because geographically Trinidad's quite closely located to America, there's a strong Americanization of like Caribbean culture. So I was sort of like brought up in that I guess that sort of marrying of two very like antithetical principles, like tradition and like modernity. So you have like the kind of like the onset of that Americanization versus like the kind of like seeds of tradition scattered around. So I suppose my grandma sort of introduced me to those things, like like the simple things of being like kind to people, saying how was your day, um, never sort of questioning your teachers or anything like that, or respecting the elderly in particular. That was like a big one. Um, but then I suppose that my mum was a bit sort of more kind of like and like with the pressures of like coming to a new country, right? Like kind of assimilating more to like London culture and these sorts of things, which is not inherently a bad thing either. It's just about trying to find that balance. So yeah, it was actually quite hard for me to locate like where tradition obviously existed growing up. And then I think when I was in my final year at university, I started sort of questioning kind of modern concepts a bit more. Um, Particularly even like even thinking about things like marriage, right? Like I used to think like, oh, like is marriage even necessary? Like what does this matter? These sorts of things. But then slowly understanding that, and it sounds all abstract and like not very sort of specific, but that it was actually enshrouded within tradition that there was like a lot of virtue. So the the virtues of being like good to people, kind to people, um, and all these sorts of things came from that kind of old school traditional practices. So that was like a really hard way to answer that question, but I think it's quite complex. I never had like a clear understanding of tradition growing up, but slowly, like I'm starting to come back to an understanding of that, or realizing where it was actually present in my upbringing. So thinking like it had nothing to do with my upbringing, then slowly realizing actually no, the good things came from tradition.
I really admire the way that you clearly have an awareness of like your historical and cultural context, and like you're kind of like very clear, kind of aware of it, and aware of how it might slash has influenced your kind of understanding and relationship with these different concepts, right?
Mhm.
It's a real superpower. It's a real superpower.
I don't know.
Um,
I think yeah, it's a hard one because like everyone, like I think particularly in like the modern sort of world or where we exist now, we think things are quite neutral. So like all the stances that we adopt come from like a neutral standpoint because secularism is purportedly all about having a neutral playground for everyone to come and like, have their own beliefs and have their own truths, blah blah blah. But like sort of the things I've been reading recently and like my journeys kind of post university actually was kind of deconstructing that a lot more to actually understand that there's biases to everything um, and that even like this kind of new liberal secular order that we kind of find ourselves in is not a neutral entity, but it actually has its own sort of end goals and its views and its ways of imposing different beliefs on people without even knowing. So like one good analogy I have is like it's like two fish they're swimming, and one fish is like to the other one. Oh, it's like what do you think about all this water around us? And then the other fish is just like, oh, like what water, right? Like that's what the kind of like this generation in particular, that's what we're kind of brought up in. Like we don't even understand or see it. Like it feels very invisible what's around us, but actually it's kind of informed our kind of outlooks in ways we haven't expected.
Was there a period going back to young Sean that you felt like you were beginning to understand who you were when you were, say, like primary school and that kind of period?
There's a few moments that stand out. I think one moment that's interesting to me is, and particularly like we're all sort of like racialized as different things. I'm just like, even though I'm from the Caribbean, I look like a Pakistani or whatever. So I'm racialized as like an Asian person. I remember being so I used to be heavily involved in drama, and like that's when I was like really small. I was probably trying to be the next sort of, I don't know, superstar or whatever. So I went to all these different like West End auditions. I went to like a Billy Elliot audition, got a couple callbacks, Oliver Twist, things like that. And then I was really good. Like I was actually really good at acting, but back then there was no such thing as like Netflix, right? So like there was no sort of roles for ethnic people. Um, there was no sort of like push for diversity or anything like that. So cool. I remember being and going to all these auditions with a bunch of different like West End things or adverts, whatever. And then the entire room was just white. Like I all and like that was and I was probably like 7 or 8 years old, and you don't really appreciate how you're racialized, right? Until you get quite like much older or have certain experiences. But before that time, I didn't really think about skin color, obviously, because I'm 7 or 8 years old. But then I would always remember stepping into these rooms, and the whole sea was just a room of white boys, English white boys everywhere. And then I remember just getting a bunch of rejections all the time, right? And there was a sort of disconnect because in my drama agency, I was like 7 or 8, but they trained me like the 16-year-olds and stuff because like they thought I was like quite exceptional and these sorts of things. That's why they put me forward to so many opportunities. But then I couldn't understand for myself why I kept getting rejected all the time for these different roles to the point where I remember coming home and I was just like to my mum, I wish I was white, right? No one imposed those views on me. It was just through my experience that I realized like I just don't like being so different. I feel like I genuinely helped in my heart as like a sort of 8-year-old or maybe even 9-year-old, I don't know, that if I was white, I'd be more successful in this field. And that's an insane thing to like sort of that's an insane realization to have as such a, like a young kid. And I think that was like the particular moment where I realized how like much race impacts things. Um, because also like coming from the Caribbean and not being Asian, the only roles that would have been sort of accessible to me were Asian roles. But then it's like I can't I remember being young thinking I can't do no Indian accent. I can't do anything like that. Like that's just not who I am. So that was like a moment of awareness that stands out to me, which I thought was quite interesting. Um, and then the kind of philosophy side or understanding the world, that was more gradual. I remember having an existential crisis in like sixth form, but we can talk about that if you want to get into that. But yeah, that was a particular.
Tell me about it, mate. Tell me about it.
No, I just remember basically I always used to have a strong conviction that like something other than this world exists. So I remember like again not really being raised any particular religion, then giving out Bibles at school. So little kind of like Bibles like that you can hold. And I remember just putting it in my blazer pocket and just holding it with me all the time because I felt special, I felt protected. I like this idea of God. Actually, to be honest, back then I didn't even sort of realize the Christian conception was that Jesus was God. I actually always thought it's just like God and Jesus was a messenger. That's generally what I thought of like Christianity. But anyways, I kept this Bible in my pocket walking around because I kind of thought it was special. And I always thought like things that good just inherently exists. There's like natural beauty in the world, like things that love as well, like the love between me and my grandma sort of showed that there's something beyond. I didn't know what it was. I just had a feeling. That's all it is. I always had a feeling. But then, as I was applying to Oxford to do PPE, I remember being in like the loft of my sixth form, um, like college because it's quite like an old building, and it was just me by myself, and I was reading a short introduction to philosophy of like what does it all mean. And it was my first exposure to like real philosophy, and like the kind of conclusion was that you can't prove anything, and like nothing sort of exists in external reality but your mind, and actually like the assumption you're making is that you have to trust your senses before you actually can trust anything outside of you exists. And that messed me up, man. That was just like, damn. Like, and it's not like I was holding the Bible at this time, by the way, in my pocket, but all those kind of preconceptions of like good, inherent truth, beauty in the world, that type of stuff. Even though I didn't really tease it out in my mind explicitly, I started thinking, damn, like I don't even think I know anything at all. Um, and honestly, I remember being there for like 10 minutes and I was just staring like into space. And I was like, shit, like what does any of this even mean? Um, and that kind of, yeah, took me on a bit of like a kind of agnostic slash atheist journey. So yeah, very different to the race thing, but they're two sort of separate ways of thinking about existence.
Have you always been introspective? That's one of the kind of impressions I'm getting is that you're someone that is very conscious of themselves, and that, like Suleiman said, like your context and the things around you. Are they these kind of moments you're giving us? Would you describe them more as like kind of flashpoints, or was it characteristic of Sean, just full stop?
No, I suppose they were sort of like flashpoints. I think obviously now, like as I speak about my experience of the past, it's definitely a lot more kind of like in depth and like thoughtful. I think, yeah, I always used to be quite self-aware. I think that's always what wanted to happen. To be honest, like even part of that might still stay with me now is that I kind of like used to love being like center of attention growing up. Like I like to be in the limelight a bit, which is kind of like similar to like similar to my mum in like a sort of complimentary way, like wanting to kind of take up space and that type of stuff. So yeah, I think so. One of my big philosophies, yeah, and I still hold this with me today, yeah, is that I am the main character. Same way you should think you're the main character. Same way Suleiman should think he's the main character. Like there's some people who live their lives and they don't actually think they're the main character in their story, but actually, like I think it's completely fine to think the universe kind of revolves around you, because that's what makes life inherently interesting. Like my life is, in my sort of perspective, a narrative. So it's a story. Um, and I don't know what's going to happen in this story, but I like to think of it as that. So um, I think that's something that's always stayed with me growing up since I was actually very small. That like this is my sort like I need to stamp my own, not in a sort of ego way, but I just need to sort of stamp my own mark in existence, if that makes sense. Not like people need to remember my name after I die or anything like that, but just like I'm here, so let me just exist.
Hmm. One concept that comes to mind when you just shared those comments is like the hero's journey and kind of the hero's arc.
Okay.
Um, I don't know whether you would want to apply that framework onto your life. Maybe that's
Tell me more about the hero's arc then, just so I understand it a bit more.
so my very elementary understanding is that
Yeah.
all heroes um it kind of or heroes typically experience um kind of certain stages of development. So a hero will experience some form of stress, some form of challenge, and then typically they will problem solve and it will strategize, it will overcome the challenge, and then there will be like some form of solution or success that's kind of on the other side of their experience. Um, and that in a very simple way is the arc that heroes and people who are successful or have strived go through. So I guess my question is, when you look back at your life, specifically maybe your teenage years, so let's say secondary school self, how would you describe your arc?
I was always very ambitious. So that's probably the sort of defining trait I had in my teenage years, particularly because, again, coming back to the awareness point, like I knew how dead my school was. Like, shout out to my school. It's produced like a lot of cool people. But obviously, like, I mean, like you both, right? That typical state school, like growing up in London ends that type of conventional story. So I sort of was quite aware that, um, and I don't really know what sort of instilled this into me. Maybe it really was my grandma and my mom that like this is the make or break. And I had a lot of young people around me, particularly like my contemporaries, um, who literally just mess about. And like I just literally knew deep down, even when it came to like, having a little girlfriend in secondary school, whatever. Um, and perhaps maybe it was a bit condescending of me, but I used to think, nah, you're gonna mess up your life pretty much. Like your art is won't you won't benefit from any of this, to be honest. Particularly because like you're already starting from a sort of like disadvantage. Like for me, my education was so important. I mean, that was definitely drilled into me, like education first, all that sort of thing, that I need to do really well. Um, and to be honest, not to like say like I was right or whatever, but like the boys who messed around in school, they're struggling now. Like I'm not saying I'm like comfy, I'm doing well for me, whatever. But honestly, like, through little things like finding a job or not even being able to go to university and get good grades, like, bro, I had to disassociate myself when I was revising sometimes, sit in a room by myself, because like even my own friends would come and like try to distract me. And I knew like, no, like that literally can't run. So then that was the very kind of educational part of like my sort of determination in the kind of academic aspect. But then the extracurricular aspect, if there was any opportunity, I'll just sign myself up to it. So I did music. So I was taught music by a guy called Femi Korioso, who's the head of or who found Ezra Collective. So like the like one of the biggest jazz bands in the UK now. So he's the drummer for them, and he's like literally a music genius. And he taught me music, and like the fact that I was able to have that sort of experience with him, I thought was pretty formational. Then I went into like youth parliament. So I was doing a lot of youth parliament with the council, how to make uh, people's lives better in the area, that type of stuff. Then I kind of excelled at youth parliament. So I gave speeches at the House of Commons and things like that. So I was doing BBC interviews and all these sorts of things, which now when I look back on it is a bit cringe because you kind of thought you were doing something back then, even though it's kind of like a glorified youth club thing. But for a young person, it's still like a good thing to do. And then on the flip side, I was doing like speaking competitions and all these sorts of things as well, because that was the thing I thought I was good at in the end. Um, and then when it came to A levels, I knew it was just time to lock in and just really revise hard. I didn't really know about Oxford's beforehand, actually. It was quite late in my journey. I remember seeing Akala speak at the Oxford Union, and I looked up to him a lot. Still do, of course. And then that's what made me think, oh, what is this Oxford place? Let me find out more about that. So definitely, I would have, I definitely thought to myself since I was throughout my teenage years, all right, next year I need to level up. Next year I need to do better. I need to do better. Um, which I don't know if I sort of have that mindset now. But perhaps it takes a bit more of a spiritual definition as opposed to a sort of like successful metrics, external metrics definition. But yeah.
That Akala speech is legendary. One of the best lectures. Next slide, please. You know when he does
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Next slide, next slide. No, he needs to do more of that. I think he needs to lean
Yeah.
into that more. I mean, I read Ricardo's Natives is somewhere on my bookshelf. Like that was a pretty amazing book as well.
I remember I had to give a short, very, very short talk about like a brief history of Sudan. And he mentions for like a bit from that lecture about Sudan and like Lower
Mm.
Egypt, Upper Egypt. So I remember lifting heavily from that lecture. Sean, I want to ask you about like the other side of things. So one thing I'm getting from what you're sharing is like there was a lot of foresight, there was a lot of like maturity that you had from young. Were there any beliefs or mindsets that have totally changed over time?
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, well, obviously, sort of quote unquote famously, I'm a Muslim now. Was a Muslim before. That's a whole belief mindset change. Um, I actually think I was quite I was on a solid straight path. Sorry, not in like a spiritual sense, just like a kind of like directional sense throughout secondary. But it was when I got to uni, um, I might have deviated from that a bit, to be honest. Um, I think that there's obviously that element of coming to like an institution like Oxford and realizing you're not the smartest person anymore. Perhaps I was a big fish in a small pond or whatever, in secondary, but then I just became like any other small fish at Oxford. Definitely was nowhere near the smartest in my class or anything like that. And I think perhaps maybe some arrogance started creeping in, maybe like a bit of ego, knowing that, of course, you know, you come from your backgrounds, whatever, and you kind of made it. I knew Oxford wasn't the be all end all as a destination, but then I guess some sort of complacency might start creeping in a bit. Um, so the way that really materialized is that, yeah, I mean, like any sort of uni student, like you know, you like to start stepping to the parties, chatting to the girl, them, all that type of stuff. Um, so I think in terms of my, and this isn't in a very radical way or anything like that, but in terms of my, I suppose, priorities, they started maybe not having as much of a directional focus as they did once upon a time. Um, and me trying to like come back to that post university or like towards the end of my university experience, um, was basically aligned with my like sort of finding of Islam. So I think like perhaps one of the greatest like kind of like moments, well not moments or like I suppose mindsets that I had that was like driven by a kind of like ego was like really not believing in gods or like not really believing that was like an intelligible thing to do. Um, I think because then if you don't do that, then the God you serve is yourself, and then once you sort of step into that realm of things, then yeah, your desires and all these sorts of things start like taking over. Um, and again, I don't want to sound like I was a mad hedonist or anything like that, because really and truly I wasn't. Because battling and pulling me back and grounding me was, of course, my upbringing, coming back home, seeing my grandma, that type of stuff. Um, but dunya became tempting, put it that way. The pleasures of this life became very tempting. I think I wanted to make a lot of money and do all these sorts of things, but yeah, I started creeping into that towards uni.
Bro, how would you describe the difference between being confident and being arrogant?
No, that's a good question. I think there's something around arrogance where you feel like you have an infallibility. So you can be confident in what you believe in, um, but you should always be aware that you could be wrong. Um, and then that understanding that you can be wrong, um, allows you to have some sort of humility as well. So I don't think confidence and humility are like trade-offs by any means. But obviously humility and arrogance are. So I think maybe if I am also trying to be as reflexive as possible, there was a bit of arrogance as soon as I kind of stepped into uni a bit. Also like I suppose when there's a quite interesting phenomenon where once you're kind of put into a different environment, you start facilitating the kind of stereotypes that are attached to people like you. So it's kind of like how Muslims post 9/11 have perhaps become a bit more strict and a bit more kind of like um I guess like conservative and harsh in their deen because they're kind of like reacting to the kind of external pressures that are put on them. Um, in the same way as like coming from ends, going into posh place at Oxford, I was trying a bit too hard to like pretend I didn't like the kind of gowns and traditions and like the fancy dining and things like that. I felt as a bit like, you know, I had to keep my grey tech fleece on. I remember my first purchase, yeah, my first term of uni with student finance, of course, was the Canada Goose. But I couldn't afford the arms, so it was just the gilet. Um, so there was that. So I think, yeah, those moments of arrogance might exist in those like yeah small actions. But yeah,
That is hilarious. I could just imagine you going up to the cashier like, okay, well, what about without the arms? All right, cool, yeah, I'll go for that. Sorry about on that point yesterday, man. How do you feel like? I mean, not just Cambridge, but just generally, like, how do you feel like in different spaces you've been in? Yeah, you've kind of wrestled with that idea of like your identity and like disentangling it from whatever the space you're in is.
Yeah, man. I think it in my mind, it links a lot with the prioritization point, right? Like I think a lot of us are connected to various communities and
Mm.
various um, values and virtues and things that we believe in, principles, etc. But then I think the beauty of faith is that it is truly, well, at least the faith that we all share is that it's an all-encompassing lifestyle, right? It's kind of the first and the foremost, it's the foundation, it's the, you know, the whole rocks and sand thing. Like you got a jar and you've got rocks and sand. Like I think of faith as the rocks, right? And it's like it's the first thing that you put into the jar, so that everything else can kind of fit around it. So like praise be to God that I think my relationship with my faith has grown over the last few years, and especially as I occupy kind of the workplace, I've become more comfortable with mentioning God's name and like kind of being more comfortable about letting people know that I'm about to pray and kind of signing off emails with God willing and like few kind of small little subtle things like that that I previously couldn't envision doing. Um, so so I'm trying to, I guess all of us are trying to find that alignment, right? That we're trying to have beliefs and ensure that our actions are kind of a reflection of our beliefs, right?
No, definitely. I think like when it comes to environments as well, it's much easier to live up to like what people expect of you than go against the kind of norms that are imposed on you. So it's very, it's much easier to like, particularly within yourself, like in your example, right, working in a corporate kind of law environment to kind of be just a sort of corporate lawyer as well. But actually, like it takes a lot of like struggle to sort of kind of keep to your kind of authentic values. The same way, like you step into um, Oxford as someone from quote unquote ends, it's much easier for you to kind of adopt that. Oh, he's from ends lifestyle. Like he could just like pretend to be that type of person, as opposed to kind of look within and realize actually I kind of like the pretty traditions and I want to sort of exist in between these worlds as opposed to kind of fit in one kind of binary thing. I think that's an interest. I don't know if there's anything. I've never read any sort of literature around it, but I'm pretty sure people have written about it. That kind of sociological viewpoint around like how people kind of adapt to the environments they're in. But I think you're really right about the priorities point for sure.
Sure. And it links to a question I was going to ask both of you, but I'll answer it myself first, which is who are your heroes, right? Who are your heroes? And when I think about that question, the people that come to mind are those that are able to be authentic in different environments, but in a way where they can see the beauty of the environments that they're navigating.
Mm.
And like they take the best of it and like they kind of resist the worst of it and they just kind of tread lightly in the world, right? So my question for both of you is who are your heroes? And tell us a bit more about them.
Um, I would say that the people I sort of look up to, but my first, I mean, there's you look up to different types of people for different things, but I think the sort of ultimate people I look up to are people who are quite like just kind and generous. So, but in perhaps maybe a more kind of simplistic, maybe like a very like Islamic way. So like the examples I'm thinking about are like people who have some sort of just like innate wisdom. So like my grandma and her older sisters. So my grandma's older sister's still alive. She's around 90. So 2 years ago, um, I went to spend a month with them. So sorry, my grandma's older sister and her immediately younger. So like they're in their late 80s. And they're very simple. They both live in one apartment. I was sleeping on the couch, they share a bed. They'd wake up, say their five prayers on time, have food at the right time as well, read their Quran, and they just, move around very slowly, have a nice little coffee. It's very simple, the simple pleasures, and then they go back to sleep. And their sort of like hold on virtues of being kind, caring, generous, it doesn't take much. They just see it as part of existence. Whereas like stepping back to like Oxford or something, everything's like a sort of intellectual battleground. People make very sort of like complex problems out of things that should be simple. Um, and the idea that some people cannot have literally any education whatsoever because they didn't go to school and just have a solid understanding of what it means to, in my eyes, be good is something that I found really admirable. Another sort of example similar to that is like, I don't know if you guys would probably have, if you travel, I've met Bedouins before. So like me kind of staying with like Bedouins in like the Jordanian desert and things like that. Again, they don't have like the kind of like prestigious education or anything that we have, but they're just so kind and just so generous because they see it as like to exist is to be kind, to exist is to be generous. And I think like that's just something that like to just to have that sort of like to see being virtuous like that as like breathing, I think is like the ultimate form of sort of wisdom that I would personally want to strive to. Um, so those are kind of like, I suppose, my heroes.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, like there's a tension that I want to unpack with you, right? And it's the tension of being ambitious
Mhm.
and wanting to like strive and make a difference in the world and like address complicated and challenging problems versus also the yearning for like simplicity and peace and kind of um and like a quiet life maybe.
Mhm.
So how have you like what do you think about that tension and like how are you how would you address it and kind of navigate
Yeah,
it?
no, I agree that there is a trade-off because I think, yeah, it's like every man's dream, right? Is to just make a bunch of money and just like open a farm with their babes, in like Granada, Alhambra, and like just yeah, just live a quiet life, forget about this life. No, I mean I obviously relate to all of that as well. I think though, um, it comes back to the self-awareness point of understanding what kind of value can you bring to the world, or like what can you do. So it's like some people, right? Like they're sort of the value they can bring to the world is the fact that they might be a really great teacher, so they might become a primary school teacher or something like that. And actually, that would probably have a lot more impact than like becoming, I don't know, some sort of MP, anyways, because you're actually like changing people's lives, like young people's lives, on the sort of scale that is really meaningful. I think like in my own sort of existence, then I kind of think about like what is it that I can bring and what can I do to help sort of do good, quote unquote, in the world. Um, and that is not going to be easy, but then life was never really meant to be easy. And like we know that this life is fundamentally a test, it's a challenge, and hiding away from the challenge or test is not like passing it at all, really. Um, so I think about I think a lot about how for example Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, he talks about how, and it's similar to this principle, how there's a sort of trend or yearning for young Muslims to go live a nice cushioned life in the UAE, or Dubai. But because it's hard to be a Muslim in the West sometimes. Like, you want to be able to hear the adhan, you want to be able to like, find halal food, you want to be able to live in an environment that's conducive to your principles. But actually, he said, well, perhaps your greatest jihad is being here and like existing in an environment that's very antithetical to Islam and actually wanting to sort of change it for the better and do good in whatever way you can. So what like come back to that point of like what are you useful at doing good down that or through that channel. So I think a lot about that, to be honest. Um, and how it's important to do that because that is just your jihad, really. And if you do it with the right intentions, then you know it's going to be all worth it in the end. Um, and yeah, I think that's basically the way I kind of get around it. And also that saying from the Prophet around like peace be upon him, that if you see an injustice, like stop it with your hand. If you can't do that, stop it with your voice. If you can't do that, then like kind of stop it like through your heart or something like that. I think that kind of laid perspective of also realizing that again, you can't or you might not be useful enough to stop every injustice, or you can't, have your hands in all these different baskets. It's important to focus on what you're good at. So that's the kind of way I kind of get around that.
When would you say you feel most at peace or most alive?
Most at peace, most alive. Um, most at peace, most alive. Most at peace. Yeah, and it sounds so sort of conventional, or so sort of like basic, right? But it's actually, if I'm strong enough, if conditional, if I'm strong enough to wake up for Fajr prayer, because honestly, like, well, I know you shouldn't bet your sins or whatever, but it's a struggle for me personally. Um, but obviously Ramadan comes around and then you turn into a superhero and you do it like every like sort of day. But if I'm able to do that, the sort of quiet that you get, I think it's second to none. And the fact that you're sort of half asleep, you don't really know what's like, you can't really think properly, but then within you, kind of embedded within your sort of consciousness, are those divine words. I think that is like the most peaceful um, experiences that one could bring. I think one particular part as well that I felt really peaceful was like when I was on my trip to Jordan, because it was a solo trip and I was in the desert. Um, I went off track a bit, and then I just stayed by myself, and I heard absolutely nothing. Hearing silence for the first time sort of makes you realize why all the prophets sort of retreated to solitude, because that is an insane experience. So I think Fajr, in a way, sort of replicates that a bit, um, in a very accessible way. So I would say that, which is ironic because obviously, will I wake up for it tomorrow? I don't know. God only knows, yeah. But then I guess that shows you a lot about humans, that we know what's good for us, yet we kind of self-sabotage a bit. What about you both, though? That'll be quite interesting to hear from both of you.
A space slash time that comes to mind is like the morning coffee. So
Mm,
before I go to work, there's a cafe that's like perfectly located because it's not near my office, but it's not too far from my office. So
okay.
it's like I feel like I've escaped, but I'm also, you know what I mean, like it's within reach. And um recently I've just really been enjoying their coffee, man. That I've much preferred to just drink it inside the cafe versus taking it away. Um, and I was having, them kind of lucid thoughts about how this coffee is just the world, bro. There's like it tastes so good, but it always finishes too quickly, and I can't get another one because then the caffeine will just mess my body up. So
Facts.
this is all I have.
Yeah.
So let's cherish it and enjoy it. And tomorrow, God willing, I'll get another one. So it's kind of like the day.
Yeah, that's fact. That's fact, actually, though. I never thought about it like that, but I completely agree. What's your coffee order?
just flat white, mate.
Yeah, me
Simple.
too. Me too. No, that's calm. Yeah,
Simple, lad, mate. Simple. Yeah. Saladin, it's when you're doing the judo, innit? When you're taking man down.
the next man gripping him up. That's what. That's when he feels alive, innit?
Mine probably is going for a walk.
But I feel like even underscoring all these experiences is that element of like just being by yourself a bit. Which again, that's another like mindset shift I had, because I think I used to sort of conceptualize myself as quite literally a city boy. Like I like the city, I like the big city, like, going around the hustle and bustle and stuff. I never used to be one with nature before, really and truly, like since post university. But that's been quite like a sort of a very meaningful sort of experience, kind of reconnect.
I think that's the 60 minutes, man. That's the 60 minutes. Sure, man. This has been a really cool conversation, man. Really grateful that you've made the time.
I hope I haven't
This is part one, man.
Yeah.
I think this is part one, and we can do this more often, man. God willing.
Thank you. Again, I'm flattered that I'm someone who you want to speak to more. Not to sound like a beg friend, but yeah, we need to do more things together for sure. Because that is only our second time, really and truly. Like, but I feel like I know you guys for a long time. So yeah.
100%, bro.